The Vikings, a name that echoes with tales of sea voyages, long ships, and distant lands. But who were they truly? The Vikings were people of the north, born from the rugged coasts and deep forests of Scandinavia, what we know today as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Their world was one of sharp contrasts, long, bright summers where the sun barely set, and winters so dark and cold that the days felt endless. They were sailors and farmers, traders and explorers, warriors and storytellers. They traveled far to England, France, even to the rivers of Russia and the shores of North America. Yet when they returned home, they lived simple lives, bound to the land, the sea, and above all, the turning of the seasons. To many, the word Viking brings images of battles, raids, and roaring warriors. But behind those moments of violence, there was another side, a quieter truth. Families gathered together, children growing, women weaving, men tending fields and animals, and all of them facing the long Nordic winters with patience, warmth, and tradition. And it is here, in the heart of winter, where the Vikings found their strength not only in conquest, but in survival. When the icy winds howled across the fjords, when the nights stretched on for months, the Vikings withdrew into their great longhouses, wooden halls built to hold families, animals, and the glowing fire at the center of their lives. This is the story not of raids and battles, but of how the Vikings lived through the cold and silence of winter. A story of wood and stone, of smoke and fire, of whispers and dreams. Winter in the north did not arrive suddenly. It crept slowly, like a shadow stretching across the land. At first, the mornings grew colder. The mist rising from the rivers lingered longer, clinging to the branches of bare trees. Frost began to paint the grass, tiny crystals sparkling when touched by the weak light of the sun. Then came the shortening days. Each afternoon the sun sank lower, casting long golden beams that quickly faded into dusk. By late autumn, the world seemed caught between sleep and wakefulness, waiting for the deep cold to descend. For the Vikings, this was the time of preparation. Men and women worked side by side, knowing that what they stored now would decide their comfort in the long months ahead. In the fields, the last grains were gathered and stored in wooden chests. Root vegetables, turnips, onions, carrots were pulled from the earth, brushed clean, and kept in cool, dark pits. Fish, caught in the last days before the ice sealed the waters, were salted and hung to dry. Meat from the autumn hunt was smoked, its scent drifting through the village as families stacked it carefully away. Children helped in small ways. They carried bundles of firewood, their cheeks red from the cold wind, their laughter rising in clouds of breath. Women wove thicker blankets from wool, their hands moving steadily as stories and songs passed between them. Men mended tools, tightened the roofs of the longhouses, and checked the strength of the walls. Every detail mattered, for winter tested not only the body, but the spirit.
When at last the first snow fell, soft and silent, it felt both like an ending and a beginning. The earth lay under a white blanket, the rivers slowed, and the forest grew hushed. The paths between villages grew narrow, buried under layers of snow. Travel became difficult and soon impossible. The people retreated into their homes, into the warmth of their hearths, where the fire's glow became the center of the universe. The Viking longhouse was not just a building, it was a world. Made of timber and thatch, its roof sloping low against the weight of snow, the longhouse was built to endure the winter's fury. Inside, it was dim, filled with the scent of smoke, wool, and wood. At the center, a hearth burned constantly, its flames fed with precious firewood. Around the hearth, families gathered: parents, children, grandparents, even animals, cows, sheep, goats, all sharing the same space, the same breath, the same warmth. The fire was not only for heat, it was the heart of the longhouse. It cooked the meals, lit the nights, and carried the voices of stories into the rafters. The smoke drifted upward through a hole in the roof, curling slowly into the cold air outside. Sometimes the smoke hung low, making eyes water, but no one complained. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant life.
Outside, the snow fell deeper. Icicles hung from the eaves, glittering in the weak sunlight. The winds howled across the fjords, rattling the walls. But inside, the world was steady, glowing, safe. Children curled under blankets of wool and fur, listening to the murmur of voices. Women hummed as they worked, spinning yarn by the firelight. Men carved wood, shaping handles, bowls, and toys. The days stretched long, but the rhythm of the hearth kept time. The Vikings did not see winter as something to fight. They saw it as a guest, harsh, demanding, but respected. Winter brought stillness. It brought families close. It gave space for stories to be told, for songs to be sung, for wisdom to pass from old to young. In the dark, in the cold, the longhouse was a place of warmth, light, and memory. Thus began the winter of the Vikings, not with a battle, but with a gathering. Not with swords, but with fire. Not with noise, but with silence broken by laughter, whispers, and the crackle of wood. The longhouse was the heart of Viking life during the endless winters. From the outside, it looked plain, a stretched wooden shape with a roof of straw or turf, low to the ground as if pressed down by the heavy sky. Snow often piled high against its sides, making it appear half-buried, like a sleeping giant resting in the frost. Yet inside, it was alive with warmth, voices, and the quiet hum of daily survival. Stepping inside, the first thing one felt was the change in air. Outside, the cold cut deep into the skin, the breath froze at the lips, and the wind howled without mercy. But within the longhouse, the air was dense with smoke and warmth. The fire in the central hearth glowed steadily, its light flickering against the timber beams. Shadows stretched long on the walls, swaying gently like dancers with each crackle of the fire. The scent was a mix of burning wood, dried fish, wool, and the faint sweetness of stored grain. The longhouse was not just for people, it was a shared shelter. Along one side of the hall, stalls were built for animals, cows, goats, sometimes even pigs, brought in to protect them from the deadly cold. Their breath added warmth, their bodies part of the living heat that kept the home alive. The low sounds of animals shifting in the straw became part of the nightly music of the house. For the Vikings, animals were not only a source of food and labor, but companions in survival. On the other side of the hall, benches lined the walls. These benches served as seats by day and as beds by night. Covered with animal skins, woven wool and straw, they became soft places where families curled together. Children pressed close to their parents, and grandparents lay wrapped in thick furs. Privacy was rare, lives were shared, stories told in whispers, laughter heard by all. In the dim glow of the hearth, each face was lit with the same light, each breath rising in the same smoky air. Above, the rafters stretched like ribs across the ceiling, darkened by years of smoke. From them hung tools, herbs, and bundles of dried meat or fish. Women often hung wool to dry, the strands slowly shifting in the warm drafts. Sometimes charms or carved figures were tied thereto, small protectors meant to keep away ill fortune. The rafters held not only food and tools, but also the weight of belief, a silent reminder of the unseen powers that moved through the Viking world. The hearth was always burning. Even when the night stretched long and the winds roared outside, someone was tasked with keeping the fire alive. To let it die was unthinkable. Fire meant survival, and so even the youngest child might rise in the night to feed it a stick of wood. The flames became like another member of the family, unpredictable, alive, and deeply necessary.
Meals were simple but comforting. A large pot often hung over the fire, filled with broth, fish, or roots simmering slowly through the day. The warmth of stew carried through the hall, filling every corner with the promise of sustenance. Bread was baked on flat stones near the fire, its scent earthy and familiar. Meals were not grand feasts, but shared bowls passed hand to hand, bites eaten with quiet gratitude. In the heart of winter, even the plainest dish was precious. Light was scarce. The fire gave a warm glow, but beyond it, the house lay in shadow. Small oil lamps made of clay or carved stone flickered weakly, filled with fish oil that smoked when lit. These small flames guided hands during weaving or carving, but most of the house remained dim. The darkness wrapped itself around the family, making the hall feel like a womb, safe from the storms outside. The sounds of the longhouse were steady and slow. The crackle of firewood, the soft shifting of animals in their stalls, the quiet hum of a mother's song to her child, the rasp of a knife carving wood. These were not sounds of battle or voyage, but of a world turned inward, focused on survival and the intimacy of shared space. Children often played quietly near the fire, with wooden toys carved by their fathers, or with simple games drawn in the ashes. They passed the long hours with laughter that rose like sparks into the smoky air. Women spun wool, their hands practiced and steady, creating thread that would be woven into cloth. Men repaired tools, carving handles or sharpening blades for the days when the snow would melt. Every task, no matter how small, carried weight, for in winter nothing could be wasted. The longhouse was not simply a shelter, it was a memory. Its walls absorbed the voices of generations, each winter adding another layer of smoke, of song, of whispered stories. To step inside was to feel the weight of countless winters before, of families who had lived and endured in the same glow, beneath the same beams, before the same fire. The hall was not only wood and straw, but a vessel of time, carrying the echoes of the past into the present. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire hummed. In that balance, the Vikings endured. The longhouse was not grand, but it was everything. A place of warmth in the cold, of light in the darkness, of life against the stillness of winter.
At the heart of every longhouse there was a fire. Not just a flame, but a constant presence, a companion, a guardian, a spirit of warmth that carried the family through the endless winter nights. The hearth was built in the center of the hall, a shallow pit of stone where logs and branches glowed red against the shadows. Around it, everything happened. Meals were cooked, stories were told, tools were mended, and warmth was shared. The fire was not just heat, it was life itself. Without it, the longhouse would become a frozen shell, a hollow place lost to the winter's breath. When one entered the hall, the first sight was always the flicker of flame. Even when smoke thickened the air, when eyes watered and throats burned, no one wished the fire gone. They would cough, rub their eyes, and smile, for the fire meant survival. The smoke carried the scent of pine and birch, sometimes sweet, sometimes sharp, drifting upward toward the dark rafters. It clung to clothing, to hair, to the wooden beams themselves, so that every longhouse smelled forever of smoke, a smell that meant home. The fire was fed carefully. Every stick of wood mattered. Every log was precious. Children gathered bundles of twigs. Women stacked branches, and men split heavier logs. In the corner of the hall, the woodpile rose like a second wall, and every family measured its comfort by its size. Too little, and fear grew in the hearts of all. Enough, and the fire would never die. At night, the hearth glowed softly, flames sinking into embers. Someone always remained near, drowsy but vigilant, feeding the fire with small sticks so that it would never fade to darkness.
In many ways, it was like caring for a living creature, nurturing it, tending it, protecting it. The fire asked for constant attention, and in return, it gave life. Meals simmered slowly above the hearth. Iron cauldrons or clay pots were suspended from wooden beams, their contents bubbling in the warmth. Stews of root vegetables, salted fish, or smoked meat filled the hall with a steady fragrance. The sound of boiling broth mixed with the crackling of wood, creating a rhythm that lulled children to sleep. Bread baked on stones near the edge of the flames, its crust darkening, its scent earthy and comforting. Eating by the fire was not only nourishment, but ritual. Bowls passed from hand to hand, spoons carved from wood dipping into the same broth, reminding all that survival was shared. The fire gave more than food and warmth. It gave light. In a world where winter swallowed the sun, where days were brief and nights endless, the fire became a small sun in the center of the home. Its glow painted faces with amber, lit the threads of wool, and gleamed on the edges of knives and tools. Around it, stories came alive, sagas of gods and heroes, whispers of the unseen, memories of ancestors. The flames flickered like voices, rising and falling, telling tales in their own silent language.
Children loved to stare into the fire, their eyes wide as sparks leapt and faded. Elders said the fire told its own stories if one looked long enough, that the patterns of flame revealed truths, and the crackling logs whispered secrets of the earth. Whether myth or memory, the fire was always listened to, always respected. There was danger in the fire as well. A log that sparked too strongly could send embers flying, and the longhouse, built of wood and straw, was ever at risk. But the Vikings did not fear the fire. They managed it with care. They knew its hunger, its power, and they treated it as both friend and force. To live with fire was to understand balance. Too little, and one froze. Too much, and one burned. Sometimes, during the longest nights, the fire became more than warmth. Families gathered close, wrapping themselves in furs, the flames painting their faces gold and shadow. Voices softened, songs rose, and even the animals seemed to settle in the rhythm. Outside, storms might rage, winds might batter the walls, but within, the fire's glow held all together. The hearth was the center not just of the hall, but of the world. Many believed the fire carried a spirit, a guardian unseen. Offerings were sometimes made, a drop of ale, a piece of bread, cast into the flames with quiet words. It was said the fire listened, that it could bring fortune or ward away misfortune. To neglect the fire was unthinkable. To honor it was to honor life itself. And so the days and nights of winter revolved around the hearth. It marked the hours, carried the stories, and bound the family as one. In its glow, the Viking world endured.
Winter outside was endless, but inside the longhouse, time was measured in the rhythm of daily work. Though the winds howled beyond the wooden walls, life within continued in quiet, steady patterns, each task a small thread in the fabric of survival. The day often began with the stirring of the fire. Long before the pale light of the sun touched the snow, someone rose to feed the embers, coaxing them into flame. The crackle of burning wood was the first sound of morning. Slowly, others stirred. Children stretched beneath their woolen blankets. Women tied their hair and gathered tools. Men pulled on thick cloaks of fur and checked the animals in their stalls. The work of winter was not the same as summer. There were no fields to till, no boats to launch, no journeys across the sea. Winter was the season of patience, of waiting, of tending to what had been gathered and stored. It was a time of making, mending, and keeping the household strong.
One of the most constant sights in the longhouse was the spinning of wool. Sheep provided thick fleece, and during winter, women turned this wool into thread. The sound of the spindle was a soft, steady music, rising and falling with the crackle of fire. From the thread came cloth, heavy tunics, warm cloaks, blankets to cover sleeping children. Each strand carried hours of quiet labor, fingers moving in rhythm while voices hummed old songs. The loom stood tall against the wall, its frame hung with threads that stretched like a frozen waterfall. Here, cloth took form, patterns simple but strong, designed to endure the cold. A blanket woven in winter might cover a cradle for years, passed from one child to another, carrying the warmth of the fire in its fibers. Men often turned their hands to wood and bone. With sharp knives, they carved handles for tools, bowls for meals, or toys for children. The shavings fell like pale curls onto the floor, mixing with straw. Some carved figures, small gods, protective spirits, animals of the hunt. These carvings were not only useful, but meaningful. They carried the touch of belief, the sense that even in the dark, one could shape the world with steady hands. Bone, too, was shaped into needles, combs, or ornaments. Each object, no matter how small, spoke of endurance. The Vikings knew that beauty and necessity could live side by side. Even in the harshest winters, they made things not just to survive, but to create a sense of life beyond survival.
The hearth was never silent. Over the flames, pots simmered slowly, filled with the steady comfort of stew. Root vegetables, dried fish, and small pieces of smoked meat created broths rich with warmth. The smell drifted through the hall, reminding all that nourishment was near. Children would lift the lids to peek, their faces glowing in the rising steam, their stomachs growling with anticipation. Women preserved what remained of the autumn harvest. Grains were ground into flour, stored carefully against moisture. Berries dried in bundles hung high among the rafters. Honey, precious and sweet, was guarded for special moments. Nothing was wasted. Every crumb had purpose, every piece of food a promise of another day. Children brought both joy and noise to the longhouse. In winter, their world shrank to the walls of wood and the circle of fire. They played with carved toys, chasing shadows on the floor, or inventing games with stones and sticks. Laughter often echoed, rising above the quiet work of their elders. Mothers kept the youngest close, wrapping them in wool, rocking them near the fire. Songs whispered softly, old lullabies that carried both comfort and memory. Grandparents told tales to curious ears, stories of gods and heroes, teaching lessons hidden in myth. In this way, even the smallest children learned the values of their people, not through battle, but through stories told by the glow of firelight.
Though the tasks changed, the rhythm remained. Morning was for fire and food. Midday was for weaving, carving, and repair. Evening was for gathering, eating, and stories. Night was for rest, the fire dimming but never dying. Time in winter did not race. It drifted like snow, slow and unhurried. Each day resembled the last, yet each day carried its own quiet weight. There was comfort in repetition, in the knowledge that while storms raged outside, the hall inside held steady, full of hands working, voices murmuring, and hearts enduring. For the children of the Vikings, winter was a world both small and endless. Small because their steps rarely carried them beyond the wooden walls of the longhouse, where snow piled high and winds cut sharp against the skin. Endless because inside the hall, time stretched like a long shadow, filled with moments of laughter, whispers, and the quiet wonder of growing up by the fire. The hearth was their playground, its glow casting shifting shapes on the floor. With simple toys, carved by their fathers from wood or bone, children invented whole worlds. Small animals, horses, oxen, or ravens, carved smooth and polished by hand, became companions for games. Wooden boats, no larger than a hand, sailed through the ashes, carrying stories of distant seas told in miniature. Even the scraps of straw that covered the floor could be woven into little shapes, plaited into dolls, or twisted into animals, alive in the imagination of young hands. Their laughter often rose above the crackle of the fire, a sound bright and fleeting against the deep silence of winter. Sometimes they played chasing games, darting between the benches and the legs of their elders, their feet light on the wooden floor. At other times, they sat in circles, whispering secrets, inventing stories of gods and heroes that mirrored the sagas they heard at night. Not all games were idle. Some taught lessons. Boys practiced with small wooden swords, clashing gently in mimicry of the warriors they admired. Girls played at weaving, learning with miniature looms, their fingers tracing the patterns of cloth they would one day make for their families. Even in play, the future was present, each game a small step toward the roles they would one day hold. Grandparents watched with soft eyes, their faces lit by the fire. Sometimes they joined in, telling riddles that children would puzzle over, or teaching chants that turned into songs. A riddle might begin with a quiet hum, then a whispered question. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at midday, and 3 in the evening? The children would giggle and guess until the answer was revealed, and the hall echoed with delight. During long evenings, when the snow pressed heavily against the roof and the wind moaned at the door, the children drew close to the hearth, their games gentler, their voices softer. They traced shapes in the ashes with sticks, or watched the sparks leap and fade. Some believed the sparks were tiny spirits dancing in and out of the fire's glow. The youngest would stare until sleep claimed them, their heads resting against a parent's arm, dreams already carrying them into imagined worlds. The animals, too, became part of play. A calf's breath might make a child laugh, or a goat's soft wool become a pillow for small hands. Puppies born in winter tumbled clumsily on the straw, their play a mirror of the children's own. In the closeness of the longhouse, life blended, human and animal, work and play, silence and laughter. Not every child's game was light. Some were shaped by stories of hardship, by the awareness that winter was a test. They played at gathering wood, at carrying water, at mending tools, games that prepared them for the duties they would shoulder in time. Yet even these games carried joy, for in their small acts, children felt the dignity of belonging, of being part of the great circle of survival. And when night came and games grew still, the children gathered around their elders for tales. Their eyes wide, they listened to sagas of Odin, Thor, and Loki, to stories of giants and gods, of the world's beginning and its end. In those moments, play turned to listening, and listening to learning. The flicker of fire became the flicker of imagination, shaping not just games, but the very dreams of the Viking world. For the children of the longhouse, winter was not only cold and silence, it was a season of discovery, of learning to weave joy from the simplest things, of finding wonder in shadows and sparks, of growing close to family and hearth. Their laughter was the lightest fire, burning alongside the flames that kept the hall alive.
The longhouse was never home to people alone. In the depth of winter, when snow sealed the doors and frosts covered every branch, the Vikings shared their shelter with animals, companions in survival, silent partners in the endurance of cold months. Along one side of the hall, stalls were built from timber, lined with straw that rustled softly beneath hooves. Here, cows shifted slowly, their warm breath rising like smoke into the dim air. Goats bleated quietly, their eyes glowing in the firelight, curious and calm. Sometimes a pig rooted in the straw, snorting as it settled near the warmth of the herd. Each animal brought not only food for the future, but heat for the present. Their bodies radiated warmth, adding to the hearth's glow, making the longhouse a shared haven of breath and life. At night, their sounds became part of the rhythm of the hall. The low moo of a cow, the shuffle of hooves, the soft chewing of hay. These sounds blended with the crackle of firewood and the murmur of voices, creating a music of winter survival. Children often lay listening, their eyes drifting closed as the hall filled with the gentle chorus of man and beast woven together in the same story. The presence of animals was more than necessity.
They were symbols of wealth, guardians of continuity. A cow that lived through the winter meant milk in spring. A goat that survived meant wool and meat for the family. A pig, fattened and strong, meant feasts when the snow melted. To care for them was to care for the future, and so even in the harshest cold, they were tended with patience and respect.
Children often slipped away from their benches to curl near the stalls, resting against the soft warmth of a goat or stroking the rough hide of a cow. Puppies born in winter tumbled clumsily across the straw, their play a joy to watch. Cats, small and sharp-eyed, prowled the shadows, keeping the hall safe from mice that might steal the precious grain. In these quiet lives there was companionship, comfort, and the simple reminder that survival was shared. Feeding the animals was a daily ritual. Men carried bundles of hay, their arms dusted with flakes of straw. Women poured water into troughs, careful not to spill, for every drop mattered. Children brought handfuls of scraps, laughing as goats nibbled eagerly from their palms. Each act of care was small, but each was necessary, a thread holding together the fragile weave of winter.
The smell of animals mingled with the smoke and stew, filling the hall with a richness that some might call harsh, but to the Vikings, it was the scent of life. It was the fragrance of endurance, of wool and hide, of hay and breath. Reminders that the longhouse was not only a shelter, but a living world. Sometimes, in the deep silence of night, when storms raged outside, the hall seemed to breathe. The fire flickered, the animals shifted, people stirred in their sleep. The sound was steady, like the pulse of a heart. Man, beast, and flame all bound together under one roof against the vast and frozen dark. For the Vikings, animals were not strangers. They were kin in the struggle, companions through the longest nights. Together they endured. Together they dreamed of spring. In the deep of winter, when the world outside lay silent under snow, food became more than survival. It became comfort, memory, and celebration. The longhouse, with its flickering hearth and smoke-stained rafters, was filled with the steady rhythm of meals that carried families through the endless nights. Most days were simple. A pot hung over the fire, its contents simmering slowly, sending up a steady steam that curled into the rafters. Inside, pieces of dried fish softened in the broth, mixed with root vegetables pulled from the earth before the frost. Onions, turnips, carrots, their flavors blending together into something warm, thick, and filling. Sometimes a piece of smoked meat was added, its deep flavor spreading through the stew, making every spoonful rich with the taste of preservation and patience. Bread was baked on flat stones, darkened by the flames. It was rough, hearty, and filling, made from barley or rye, sometimes mixed with crushed seeds or herbs. The smell of baking bread rising above the scent of wood smoke was a comfort that touched every heart. Each bite was shared, torn by hand, passed from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild. Drinks, too, carried warmth. Ale brewed from barley, stored in wooden barrels, was sipped slowly, its strength reminding the people of summer's harvest. Mead, when it was available, sweetened the tongue with honey, a rare delight savored in small amounts. Water was often drawn from melted snow, its chill softened when poured near the fire. Winter meals were possible only because of careful preparation. In autumn, fish had been salted and hung to dry, meat smoked and stored, berries dried and kept in bundles. Honey was sealed in jars, flour stored in wooden chests. Each family knew that waste was dangerous. Every scrap was precious, every crumb guarded. Children were taught from their earliest years to respect food, to eat with care, to understand that every mouthful was a gift of survival. But food was not hoarded in silence, it was shared. A visitor who came through the snow, weary and cold, would always be given a place by the fire and a bowl from the pot. Generosity was a shield against the harshness of winter. To eat together was to live together, and the bonds of community were strengthened with every meal.
Not every day was ordinary. There were moments, rare and treasured, when meals became feasts. On special nights, families prepared more than the usual stew. A pig, saved for such a time, might be slaughtered, its meat roasted slowly over the flames. Fat dripped and sizzled, filling the hall with a scent so rich it lingered for days. Feasts were not only about food, they were about gathering, singing, remembering. Elders raised horns of ale, their voices carrying blessings for the family, for the animals, for the seasons yet to come. Children laughed with joy as their bowls were filled again and again, their cheeks flushed with warmth and delight. Stories flowed more freely, songs rose louder, and for a time the longhouse glowed brighter than the storm outside. To the Vikings, food was more than sustenance. It was a link to the earth, the sea, the animals, and the gods themselves. A bowl of stew carried the memory of a hunt, of hands that gathered, of summer fields now hidden under snow. Bread carried the strength of the harvest, the labor of many hands, the warmth of sunlight now distant. Mead carried the sweetness of bees, the gift of flowers that would bloom again when the frost released its grip. Sometimes small offerings were given, a piece of bread cast into the fire, a drop of ale spilled with quiet words, tokens to honor unseen spirits, to thank the hearth for its warmth, the gods for their gifts, the ancestors for their guidance. Eating was not only an act of survival, but an act of gratitude.
Day by day, bowl by bowl, winter passed through the meals shared around the hearth. In the long silence of snow and storm, the warmth of stew, the smell of bread, the sweetness of honey, and the laughter of shared feasts became the heartbeat of the hall. Food bound the Vikings together, body and spirit. It reminded them that even in the harshest season, there was richness, there was joy, and there was life. When the long nights of winter stretched endlessly, when the winds rattled the walls and snow pressed against the roof, it was stories and songs that kept the spirit of the Vikings alive. Around the hearth, in the glow of flickering fire, voices rose softly, weaving together memory, myth, and melody. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was a stage for words. Elders leaned close to the flames, their faces carved by shadow and light, their voices steady, carrying tales that had passed through countless winters. Children, wide-eyed and silent, drew nearer, their breath misting in the smoky air. Even the adults, weary from daily labor, paused in their work to listen. In those moments, the fire and the voice became one, glowing threads that bound the past to the present. Many of the stories told were sagas, long tales of gods, heroes, and the shaping of the world. Odin, the All-Father, who sacrificed an eye for wisdom. Thor, the Thunderer, whose hammer struck against giants and storms. Loki, the trickster, whose cleverness brought both mischief and salvation. These figures lived in the words of the elders, their deeds painted across the smoke-darkened beams of the hall. Children gasped at the mention of giants lurking in icy lands, or whispered when told of the great wolf Fenrir, whose jaws could swallow the sun. Yet even these fierce tales carried lessons of courage, of wit, and endurance. They reminded all that the world was vast and filled with powers both seen and unseen, and that survival came not only from strength, but from wisdom and respect.
Not all stories were of gods and giants. Some were of ancestors, of journeys across seas, of harvests long past, of winters endured before. A grandmother might speak of her youth, of a time when the fjord froze so solid that men walked across it. A father might recall his first voyage, when the salt spray stung his face and the wind filled the sail. These stories were threads of memory, weaving each generation into the next. Children listened, storing these tales like treasures to be repeated when their own hair turned gray. In this way, the longhouse carried not only voices, but the weight of lineage, the unbroken chain of lives. When words grew weary, songs rose, sometimes soft, almost whispered, like lullabies drifting into the rafters, sometimes strong and steady, voices joining in harmony, their tones filling the hall with warmth.
Songs told of the sea, of oars striking waves in rhythm. They told of fields golden with grain, of hunts in summer forests, of lovers meeting under the moon. Some were playful, with rhymes that made children laugh. Others were solemn, chants that called on the gods to watch over the hall, to keep fire burning, to guide the sun back from its long absence. The rhythm of song matched the rhythm of life, the beat of a drum, the clap of hands, the tapping of feet on wooden floor, all blended with the crackle of fire. Music softened the endless night, carrying hearts beyond the walls of the longhouse, beyond the storms, into a space where memory and hope intertwined.
As night deepened, the songs turned gentle. Mothers rocked their children, humming melodies that had been sung for centuries. The words were simple, but the tone carried safety, a promise that even in the darkest season, light would return. Slowly, children drifted into sleep, their dreams filled with gods and heroes, with ships and stars, with laughter and fire. The hall itself seemed to rest with them. Voices fell to whispers, then to silence. Only the crackle of the hearth remained, glowing like the echo of a song.
Winter stretched on, silent and unyielding. The nights were so long that it seemed the world had forgotten the sun. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops, pressing down with its weight, while the wind circled the house like a restless spirit. Yet inside the longhouse, the fire glowed and life endured. The long night was not counted in hours, but in moments. The soft breathing of children asleep beneath woolen blankets, the shifting of animals in their stalls, the murmur of voices fading into silence. The hall was wrapped in darkness, broken only by the embers' glow. Time itself felt slow, like the snow drifting past the small, shuttered windows. People dreamed more in winter. Dreams were spoken of in the mornings, shared like bread around the hearth. A woman might speak of a dream where green fields stretched forever, flowers bright against the sun. A child might tell of flying with ravens across the fjords, their wings strong against the storm. Elders listened carefully, nodding, for dreams were not idle. They were whispers of the unseen, signs of what was to come.
As the long nights deepened, the thought of spring became a quiet promise. In the stillness, people spoke of the thaw, of rivers breaking free from ice, of the first shoots of green piercing the snow. They spoke of lambs born in meadows, of sails filled with wind once more, of fields golden with grain. Spring was far away, but in winter it lived in every heart, a seed waiting in silence. Until then, they endured. They tended the fire, fed the animals, wove the wool, told the stories, sang the songs. Each act was a prayer, each day a step toward the light. The hall carried them, the fire guided them, and together they passed through the longest night. And when, at last, the sun returned, weak at first, then stronger, climbing higher in the sky, the people of the longhouse stepped outside, their eyes blinking against the brightness. The snow began to soften, the ice to crack, the earth to breathe again. They felt the warmth on their faces, smelled the wet soil beneath the thawing frost. The winter was over, but its memory remained, of closeness, of stories, of survival shared. For in the heart of the longhouse, the Vikings had not only endured the cold, they had carried the flame of life across the darkness into the promise of spring.